Hello, and thank you for joining me. In this session, we're going to talk about arrays. Arrays are powerful tools for developers. They allow us to store large amounts of organized data. Where a variable stores one piece of information, an array can store multiple pieces of information. If you look at the image presented to the left, you'll see three sheets of numbers. Think of a single square on one of those sheets that's holding a single number as a piece of information. That would represent a typical variable holding a single piece of information. Now, the entire collection of rows and columns and sheets, that would represent an array holding a large amount of organized data. That gives us an idea of what an array is and how it compares to a variable. Now that we've been introduced to the concept of an array, we need to understand the different types of arrays. As you can see from the breakdown presented here, there are essentially four basic types of arrays. We also see that arrays consist of individual elements. And again, an array can be static or dynamic, or it can be single or multidimensional. Arrays also have an option base, which we're going to get into more detail later. The size of an array is determined by its lower boundary and its upper boundary. And as you can see here, we have two declarations of the same array. We have a string array with a size of 5 and a string array with a size of 1 to 5. These are actually the same array, but I'll show you the difference. In the first case, we have a string array of 5, and that 5 is the size of the array. The type of data that goes in there will be string values. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that the lower boundary of this array, because it has a generic declaration of 5, the lower boundary is actually going to be 0, or it's going to have a base of 0. So what it's really going to look like is this right here, what we have listed. So even though we have it written like this, that's actually a shorthand version of this down here. This array is going to have a lower boundary of 0 and an upper boundary of 5. And what that means is that it's actually going to have 6 elements in it. Now down here, where we have an array with a lower boundary of 1 and an upper boundary of 5, this will only have 5 elements in it. So what you want to keep in mind is that whenever you declare an array, if you only put the upper boundary, the default value for the lower boundary is always going to be 0, and that's going to add an additional array. So here we have a size of 5, but the number of elements will actually be 6. You can change that by either specifying the lower boundary, or if you go to the top of the module and you type in option base 1, and what that'll do is that will set the default lower boundary to 1. So again, down here we have two arrays, one that stores numbers, one that stores strings. Both of them are sized with a lower boundary of 1 and an upper boundary of 5. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take those two arrays and we're going to load them. In this case, we're working with a static array. More specifically, we're working with a single dimensional static array. What that means that these values are fixed. This is not going to change. The values listed here will not change. So if you notice here in our number array, we go to element 1 and we assign a value, element 2 assign a value, and we do the same thing with the other array. We go to element 1, element 2, and if you notice, we're putting in string values because it's a string array, and that's the data types. Now that we've loaded the array, we actually want to go through and print out the values. In this case, we're going to use a for next loop. If you notice, I have my interval values set from 1 to 5, which also happens to coincide with the lower boundary and the upper boundary of our two arrays. So in this case, whenever I equals 1, I pull the value for the string array for element 1, and the number array, I pull the element for number array 1, and that's going to print out the following data. It's going to print out the values that we listed into the elements. So in this example, we worked with a static array, and we knew the size of the array, so we knew that size wasn't going to be changing, and we loaded the elements of it. We then took those elements and we pulled them and printed them using this for next loop. Okay, before we were talking about static arrays. And the thing about a static array is that the size never changes. However, there are going to be instances where as a developer, you're going to have an array, but you're going to need that size to change, the size of the array. And the only way to do that is with a dynamic array. So what I want you to notice here is, here we have an array, we declare it, it's going to store number values. And initially we start off with a value of 10. So I go ahead and I just create a variable and I assign it the value of 10. And I'm going to call that variable array size. And then what I do is whenever I want to resize my array, I basically redim it and I put the size that I want to set it at. So when I initially declare my array up here, I don't put any size in. Whenever I go ahead and decide on a size, and that can be a calculated value, is I go ahead and I redim the array or redimension it, and I put my value in there. Now, depending on what your option base is set at, and again, that's going to be the notation at the top of a module, it's going to be a compiler note. If you have your option base set at 0, or you have no option base set, it's going to be 0, and that's going to be our default lower boundary. If you have it set at 1, then the lower boundary is going to be 1. So you also need to take that into account whenever you're creating a dynamic array. Now, with the dynamic array, and also with the static array, we have a lower boundary and an upward boundary. So if we want to load our array, we can do it with the for next loop, and we can actually just specify that we want to store at the lower boundary of that array, and we will go to the upper boundary of that array. And the nice thing about that is that we can have an array of any size as we need it, and we can load it using a loop function that'll work within the confines of those boundaries.